And, you know, I have to tell you, I was more than a little nervous about moderating the panel this morning. Not that the moderator has to be the full-on expert about a given subject, but it helps if you have good and standing grounding in whatever you're going to talk about, so your questions are not sort of completely pedestrian, right? And frankly, you know, the majority of my work in drug policy reform has been centered around criminal justice reform. And I, was trying to figure out, where do I fit into this conversation? Does it make sense for me to be here? I have not had much to do with marijuana campaigns, with the exception of working with you, Corey, and Dr. Malek. Where you at, Dr. Malek? On the DC campaign last year. But other than that, there hasn't been that much. A little bit with the stop and frisk arrests in New York, of course. And I tell you, it was interesting. When I got up at my usual 3:30 in the morning to kind of meditate on things, I thought that we're having this on the final day, right? In a conversation and a conference that's been largely dominated by a single question, right? What about Pookie?
Yeah.
What about Pookie?
And Puka.
All of us anonymous raise that question continually, which is another way of saying, how are we going to ensure that the most harmed among us are not left out as we seek to repair those harms? Christians would say, how do we care for the least of these? Right? I was struck yesterday, Deborah Small's extraordinary talk on the human rights opening plenary panel, and she said, this is a question of reparations. I am here to collect a check.
Got that right. Got that right.
And equally in private and public conversations, the question of accountability. Who won't take the weight? Right? That people were very much aware of what would happen as they created mandatory minimums. They'd done it before. It wasn't a new venture. They knew what would happen to this society. They knew the cost it would take. They knew what would happen if they sent people home from prison with no way to re-enter into society. They knew.
That's right.
It's going to take the weight. I'm struck by the battles we've had to have with the marijuana industry. Who knew? When they fought for certain regulations. They were aware of the conversation in the very first marijuana industry meeting that was held. After I had a conversation with Michelle Alexander in 2014 when she said, how is it the white boys about to get rich on stuff black boys been going to prison for? She said it, and they knew it, and they haven't changed it. And we're all aware that we live in a nation that the majority of people who are born into poverty will never get a chance to work out of that poverty. 40% of black children every day are born into abject poverty, which means you're born into a family of 4 living on under $15,000 a year, and the percentage and the likelihood of you getting out of that means that is probably somewhere, give me the number, Deb, it's under 10%. It's under 10%, in some states it's less than that. So I have this conversation, and I'm going to need your help in that context. All of this was on my mind because I was looking at my daughter, who I hadn't looked at all week, while she was sleeping. And I thought, is she going to have this conversation in 15 years? Is she going to have a conversation with maybe her child? The conversation that Martin Luther King had and said, why we can't wait? Or Deborah Small saying, it doesn't help us to pull the stick halfway out. So all of this was on my mind when I was coming into the room, along with saying happy birthday, because we celebrate our life too, right? Within the context of this. And so our 60 years is a victory. We celebrate that. 60 years and still sane. Scott is there. It could have been otherwise. So I want to have and acknowledge the conversation that I'd like to have, please, in that frame. You know, I almost ran over Dr. Malay. Yes, you're like, I don't know what questions to ask him. Equally ran down my colleague Tamar. But I woke up this morning, and tomorrow I knew the thing that I wanted to talk about. That this isn't about waiting, it's about asking questions. And maybe I'll start here, is, you know, let's first begin by maybe talking about what exactly we mean when we say reparations. What's the real deal? What are we talking about? If we were to collect that check, what would it look like? Deborah, let me ask to begin with you, and as others would like to weigh in, I'd like to invite you to do so.
So, two things. One, my conversation about reparations is very much given by an experience I had more than 15 years ago, one that I shared with Dorsey, who's here in the room. We both had the ability and the honor of being able to go to the World Conference Against Racism in Durban. And there was every day a meeting of the African diaspora. It's the first time I actually ever felt part of the diaspora, because every day all the African people who were there from every part of the planet came together for a meeting. And we talked about what reparations means. And for me, that was so transformational, because it wasn't just about the check in terms of what we're talking about economically. The conversation for reparations that we had there was about repairing all the ways in which enslavement and racism have damaged people, black people and white people, men and women, which means repairing the history of the story that we tell ourselves about who we are and how we've interacted with each other, acknowledging the actual harms that we've inflicted on each other, and just as importantly, and I really need for people to hear this part of it, is to acknowledge the ways in which current levels of wealth and privilege are the result of the extraction of wealth from other people. Yeah. Because there's this basic conversation that people have that somehow they earned what they got without it coming from somebody else. And part of the system that we're in, it's like as it relates specifically to marijuana, is the ability of people to be able to even access the capital to enter the industry is dependent on them never having been arrested for the exact activities that they were engaged in. And for me, one of the most frustrating parts of doing public policy reform around drugs, and particularly, not exclusively, but particularly talking to a lot of white people, especially white progressives, is their unwillingness to acknowledge that our anger is not only because of our disproportionate targeting, sentencing, and confinement, but for the fact that we're not only doing the time for our crime, we're doing the time for your crimes. Yeah. We're doing the time for your crimes. We're paying the price for your behavior. We're paying the price for your criminality and the illusion that you have that somehow you're less criminal than we are. Yeah. So for me, reparations is about changing that conversation, speaking truth to that, and then actually looking at what is it to redistribute wealth. Because we, again, have this conversation about wealth redistribution as if we haven't been doing it all along. We have. We've just been distributing it upwards. So let's be honest about that. And for those of you who haven't done so, I would really urge you to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece on the case for reparations, which is incredibly well researched and brings to the point that this is not just about things that happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It's about stuff that happened in my own lifetime, in our own lifetime. And I'll just leave it with this last thing, which for me is part of the reparations conversation. When I was in graduate school, people would say to me, don't you feel lucky to be here? And the first year, I did feel lucky. I was a poor girl from, East New York, and I never thought I'd end up at Harvard Law School. So I was like, yeah, I'm lucky. But then the second year, when folks are I'm like, hell the fuck no. And they're like, well, why not? And because what I was said to them, and the clarity that I got is that I said to them, I'm very clear that many of you would not be here if your parents had had to compete with my parents.
That's right.
And the fact that they never, ever, ever considered that part of where we are is the result of the exclusion of people for so long periods of time, not having to compete, which allows you to have an edge, a privilege that you didn't actually earn. So for me, I'm like, where I am is for us, all of us, to actually claim the space that has belonged to us all along, without apology, without regret, and like right now.
So, I'm like sick and tired of being sick and tired of having a conversation. So my mind is moving into how to implement this. And to me, even though the federal government has not approved this process as of yet, there is still a way that we can kind of, we as people of color, we as women get into this field, in my mind, by demanding all of the people who are currently in the field do sort of a similar to what the government does as like a subcontractor. And bring people in who do not have the funds necessarily to start up, which it really actually takes about $2,000. But now they're asking you for like, you know, your great-grandchildren's firstborns, which is unrealistic and not really needed. You just need some seeds and some nice fertile land, and that's a great start. Also, the cultivation piece, that seems to be something that everyone wants a hold of, and only a certain amount of people are getting that opportunity to do. Cultivation is very easy for us to enter into, and subcontracting, demanding that they subcontract minorities and women as their sort of, are people familiar with subcontracting? Because I don't want to, okay, great. So that's my way in looking at how we, as people who are disproportionately sort of taken out of this game, get into the game.
I wanted to follow up on the question about reparations, because I think it's so critical. And but let's be really clear. We need full reparations in this country for slavery and the institutional and systematic racism that we have carried on since slavery. Marijuana legalization is just one avenue towards that. It is not the answer. But it is a vehicle to carry some very serious policy implications forward that will advance reparations, including some fiscal components. So I see marijuana legalization as an opportunity to do this, but much more has to be done. And if you look on my Twitter feed, what I say is about my description, every day is an opportunity to reparate. Every day, every moment, there is an opportunity to reparate, and we should live our lives that way as white people. But in terms of the marijuana legalization, there are some great opportunities. And I think anybody who is in a position to craft a marijuana legalization initiative or to advise the people who are crafting, we should really come together around a common core set of demands. And in the California effort, we have done that. And I really want to thank Deborah for being there for me from the beginning, and Dorsey, asking the what about Pookie question. And I consulted them both throughout this process and really relied on them, both their wisdom and their knowledge, but also their voices out there in the public demanding that we address these issues. So there's three ways to do this: revenue allocation, community reinvestment funds. We were able to get $50 million into the California initiative annually for a community reinvestment fund. That money is going to go directly to communities who've been most impacted by the war on drugs, reducing barriers to reentry, expungement services, mental health, substance abuse services, a whole list. And then after that, 60% of the revenue allocation is going to go to drug treatment for youth, intervention, prevention. The third area is criminal justice reforms. And there's a huge opportunity to do that through the initiative process. Ours will go a little further than others have gone, but there's a long way to go. So retroactive sentencing reduction for anybody who has a marijuana crime and making that as automatic as possible. And then reducing crimes for people who operate outside of the new legal market. And the third area is access to the industry, and I think we're going to talk a lot about that. But the first piece in order to have access to the industry is to not exclude people with records. And it's amazing how hard it is to make that argument in Sacramento or whatever your capital may be. It's amazing how people don't want to hear that. And I have to say, when we did the medical marijuana regulation was going through in California last year, not one, well that's not true, there was one, marijuana industry entity stood up on this issue. We asked people to stand with us, nobody would. Other than Harborside, because it would have affected directly the owner and director of Harborside. Everybody else passed, nobody wanted to fight about that issue, and so in medical marijuana in California, all people with felons may, not shall, be excluded from licensure. I'm proud to say that for the recreational legislation, ballot language, particularly drug priors, cannot be used as exclusionary criteria for licensure.
Vicki, part of the reason that we can't find very many allies is that we've so normalized the ongoing punishment of people who've been in prison, where most people who've been in prison can't get licensed for anything. This is part of a continuum, right? So you can't get a license to be a notary public. You can't get a license to own a bar. There's so many things that it's become normal in our society, which is why it becomes then so important to begin to pull apart some of this and get to the foundational arguments. It becomes like, well, of course we wouldn't give a license to it. And even asking for it makes you seem like you're crazy.
From a Caribbean perspective, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of reparation, because where, for example, a Rastafarian community is concerned, several of them have been arrested and beaten and locked up and dehumanized because of their involvement in ganja. Excuse me if I don't say marijuana. I'm a ganja person, right? And because of that, the issue of reparation is important. If you were at my colleague's presentation yesterday, you would hear his take on the Rastafari community. But more for me is the access to land. Somebody mentioned capital. I mean, we can't discuss reparation without discussing access to land. And I'm glad we have a medical marijuana framework. It's the beginning, but it's not it. For Jamaica, it's not it. For Rastafarian community, traditional folk community, that's not it. Because you're talking about finding capital, where if somebody's coming from prison, highly unlikely we don't have that capital. And you're talking about land that most of my growers in St. Catherine are growing on crown land, on government land, somewhere in the bush, somewhere in the swamp area. So the issue of reparation has to be dealt with in terms of access to capital, access to land, for us to start that discussion. And I'm hoping to get further into that, because that is the beginning of a number of things. I mean, where are we going to be growing from? I mean, it's crazy. So let's be real. I mean, where do we get the land? And this is not just a Jamaican thing, it's a Caribbean thing. And I suspect it's even here in the United States.
Malcolm X said land is the basis for freedom. Malcolm X said it. Thank you, Vicki. Bring that. Give Jamaica a round of applause.
In the area of reparations, I believe that, is this on? I believe that...
Close to your mouth, Corey.
Closer to my mouth?
It's a little early, and we got the underage in the house.
I'll pass. I'll just be louder. How about that? But seriously though, in the area of reparations, I believe that, you know, the best thing and our best opportunity is through ownership. The waterfalls from ownership water all lands. At the end of the day, if And I'll give you an example right here in Washington, D.C. A year and a half after we had started the program, I sat in front of 2 of our council members in their office, and I said, if you had to guess, because I know you don't know, but if you had to guess, how many African Americans would you think are actually working in the industry outside of my company? And after we got through all of their numbers, I just let them know that the answer is 0. And that's because because my company is the only company that is minority owned. But then we went a little deeper, and I was like, how many women do you think work in the industry that are not related to the owner? And that answer was 0 too. Ownership is a proven access channel. And right now, we cannot get policy a lot of times to get into the room when we're discussing how we're actually going to regulate the industry. You see, it's not often the law that ends up cutting us out. These laws are written very vaguely. But then when we're actually writing the rules on how we're going to enact the law, that's when we say things like, you can't have a prior. You can't have, well, you must have $200,000 deposit. And then you have to pay a $250,000 annual license fee or biannual license fee. I mean, that's where we're starting to carve up the pie, but that's also where if policy were in that room, just by merely asking the question why do you have to have a $250,000 fee? And just pulling the wool out, pulling the blanket back and just exposing that right there, you can make the biggest change possible. Because if you keep it fair, we will apply. We've proven that. And we will win. I've proven that. And so at the end of the day, if we can get ownership going, we can begin to solve our own problems. And we can demand our reparations.
Thank you, Corey.
This from multiple angles. So we need.
Is her mic on?
It's on, but it's low.
Okay. So we need to change the law and policy. We need ownership. And we need a third thing. We need a culture change. And let me tell you how I think that's going to happen. Have any of you had the experience where you've been in a room making an important decision in a group, and perhaps you're the only woman, perhaps you're the only person of color, perhaps both, and you raise your hand to say something, and for every person who supports you, there's another person whose eyes start to glaze over because she's going to talk about race again, right? I've been in those meetings a lot, and a lot of them are when we're talking about shaping these policies. And what I do is, I think about the time in 2006 when I first saw Deborah Peterson Small speak. And it was the first time I heard anyone say that the drug war is the new Jim Crow. And I saw her on the plane and she was trying to sleep. I know you don't remember this, but I said, Deborah, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I need you to know that I saw you speak and you shook me to my core. And you changed the trajectory of my life. And when I go to those meetings, I bring her with me.
Yes.
And I can tell from your faces when I see her speak that you all are going to do the same thing. And that's how we're going to change the culture, and we're going to make it completely unacceptable for a marijuana law to pass unless it's accessible to everybody.
Let me take a minute to really thank the panel. You know, I spent 7 years producing Essence Music Festival, and so I'm a difficult producer. I will make you get on phone calls with me. I will parse the questions. I will make sure you're prepared. I will go over it. I will harass you. I'm annoying. In any of the panels that I curated, Jessica Halai helped me very much in pulling the questions together for this. But as you so beautifully just said, Shani, you know, you gotta be shaped. You gotta allow yourself to be transformed. And even though I'm New Dorsey and all of us are never gonna come with what about Pookie, I said I'm gonna just let that ride. Just come and let it do what it do. And you know, and so I didn't prepare any of the questions that I had this morning. At 9:08 in my room, I told my daughter, give me another second so I can finish writing my notes. And the magnificence with which this group of people asked a question they didn't know I was going to ask was just astounding. Thank you to each of you. Give them another round. increasingly aware of, I think was it LBJ Deborah who said, or was it Barack Obama? Anybody shame them? I know it is. About wanting to have change in the society where the activists were saying whatever it was, they said, well, you got to make me do it, right? You got to make me do it. And I'm increasingly aware that so much of our activism happens in the state houses that we might as well be that politician, right? And it made me think a lot about this morning that if we want to see change in the marijuana industry, is it for us to right now, at this moment, be in the state house or be in the street? I don't know. I think a conversation has shifted tremendously because of the street activism that we've seen because of the young people in Ferguson and Baltimore and around the country who demand to be recognized that Black Lives Matter. And I think that shifted. Because they'll know what to do when you say it in the street. And maybe it's a little hard because sometimes you're parsing it, right? And figuring out what compromises you have to make. I don't know if that's true. I don't do that part. But I just wanted to throw that out there and ask you what you thought about that. Is this, if we're going to change the way that we regulate marijuana going forward, if we're saying it's only going halfway, if we're saying it's not inclusive enough, do we ensure inclusion by taking that message to the street and getting the buy-in and activism and support of the people who are directly affected by it? Do you want to take the first shot at that? Look, you're making it ready now. I ain't gonna mess with that.
Switch mics.
It's something that I feel passionate about because in my introduction, yes, I'm a PhD student. Yes, I helped to coordinate the SSDP at UWI. But more than that, I find that my greatest joy comes from when I'm in the fields with the growers. Because these are persons who are not educated. They don't have the access to the politician, the access to knowledge. And when you are able to bring their voices to that level, it makes a big difference. I mean, this entire regulation on decriminalization was because we were able to say to our politicians, to say to our Minister of Justice, this is affecting us. We had a situation where a young man was arrested and for a spliff, a joint, a spliff we call, you guys call it joint, and beaten to death in jail. The police denies that it wasn't them, it was prisoners, but he died, that's the bottom line. And that is the situation that we're facing. Our growers, I mean, yes, everybody's talking about Jamaica and the model. The fact is, we're still seen as criminals. We're still seen as drug traffickers, growers of an illicit substance. Because even in the regulation, and I brought it, because there is a section in the regulation here that says to you, fines in the Dangerous Drugs Administration Act have been significantly increased for exportation, cultivation, possession, selling, and trafficking of illegal drugs, in which ganja is still seen as an illegal drug. An article came out Thursday, 3,000 pounds of marijuana from St. Catherine was seized and all of the persons arrested. Now, that's something we'll have to deal with. And this is a crop, these are lives. One particular young lady, she wants to find fees to go back to school. And somebody gave her a deal to take 1 pound. 1 pound of cannabis to Curacao, which is 453 grams in your term. And she got 12 months imprisonment. This is a 19-year-old. 12 months imprisonment, a total charge of 28,000 Jamaican dollars, 4,000 for possession of ganja, 8,000 for dealing in drugs, and 16,000 for exportation of ganja. This is a 19-year-old. And I've asked my friends to try and find out what's happening with that case. Now, this is somebody who don't have a voice. This is the person we will have to represent. And we can't do that by sitting in our university and sitting in our offices. We have to save lives. I have to be the person to negotiate between our growers, between our young people. And why it pains me is that this conversation is important, but this move and this campaign against cannabis has increased since the decriminalization in Jamaica, because there is still that discourse that you're dealers, you're drug traffickers, you're facilitators of persons who are growing illicit drugs. So we need to be the voice of the voiceless. I mean, this conference is good, but what do we do when we get back home? For me, it's the change that I can bring to the farmer's life, to this 19-year-old. I mean, she's trying to get school expenses, and now Onika Brown is getting a record.
Somebody else? Oh, jump in, yeah. And then give it to Simone afterwards. Thanks, Corey.
If the question is, do you do it in the State House or do you do it in the streets, I believe that you have to do it in both.
Yeah, okay.
And you have to do it with passion in both. Like the people that have the opportunity to actually be in the State House and in the room, you need to have the same, you need to express the same level of frustration when you see things going down that dark path, right? You need, and the reason why we need it in the streets, honestly, is because legislators need to remember that it ain't no fun if the rabbit gets the gun. And so, you know, you have to be able to have someone in the room that's constantly reminding them that the people are not going to stand for this. They're prepared to organize, they're prepared to make sure you don't have a job after your next election, they're prepared to do everything that's necessary to make sure that this goes down in a fair and equitable way. They want a seat at the table, let's figure out how to give it to them. And it starts with having someone inside the room that can actually express the concerns in a way that fits into the framework and makes it actually possible.
So I love that, Corey, and as we go to Simone, it's almost what reminds me of what the Black Panthers used to call, you know, an above ground and underground strategy. And so we saw some people and we didn't see others. But in this context, it means that in a culture, in a nonprofit industry culture that's very heavily invested and top heavily invested in supporting people who are doing policy advocacy work at the State House, there probably needs to be equal investment for people who are doing grassroots organizing and education on the ground, right?
So I was gonna go a totally different direction, but you just mentioned my legacy. I'm a daughter of a Panther, so shock and awe is definitely the way to go when you're talking about, you know their history. It was shock and awe, and they walked themselves into the areas where policies were being created. So the streets. When the streets speak collectively, it is a very powerful process. It is a quick process to get things done because there is a sense of collective, desire for change. In New York currently, we are moving towards that collective desire for change. We are reaching out to college students. We are educating, we are trying to destigmatize the whole process with our own people who have these concepts about marijuana and what it has done to them personally or what they have heard about the substance, not even knowing there are 250 strains, so you're probably using the wrong one for you, because it does the body good. It depends on which one you're using for the body, right? So even those little pieces of nuggets, people need to understand the process in which this is moving forward, and it has to move forward with educating people, with sort of shifting the concept, which will bring me into a little bit of what I did yesterday, which I wanted to start with. I was on the train coming here, and I was sitting next to a man that I didn't know, and we started having a conversation. I said, I'm coming here to speak about cannabis. And he goes, oh. And I said, well, actually, I'm coming to speak to a panel, and we're probably going to talk about, more or less inclusion, but there are things that, people need to understand about cannabis as far as the medical field particularly. People are just given strains and don't necessarily know. They're being used as guinea pigs and don't necessarily know what and how that's going to personally affect their body, because everyone's chemistry is different, and depending on what you've been doing with yourself for however many years you live, it's going to affect you differently. And then, you know, that research needs to be done. And on top of that, textile and industrial, we need to move and look at it as an eco-friendly piece to our, and he was like, oh, I would have never thought you would have all those concepts. I just thought you wanted to smoke it. Are you upset? And I'm like, no, I'm not, but this is why we need to have more conversations. To make a long story short, we're connected, and he's thinking about a beverage, and he wants me to consult him. So these are the conversations, no, seriously. And this is all on a train here to DC. These are the conversations that you can begin to have with people beyond the smoking and the negative aspects of what people are looking at this substance as, and let them know that you know beyond that the uses of this substance and why we need you to be on board. And that's why I'm taking your number and your email when it's time for us to decide upon, you know, federal legalization.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna get Shailene in the conversation, and then Deborah, and Lindsay, and then Lynn. Okay.
So I would like to talk about strategy and where the power lies for a moment. So if you are in that room where the policy is being made, and I know a lot of you are, it's a little bit easier because you can simply say, here are my deal breakers. If you're going to perpetuate the discrimination in the drug war and exclude people with felonies, I'm not going to stand at your press conference, period. If you are on the ground, you are more or equally important. And we have just seen that in Ohio Issue 3, which was a game changer, which proved that no matter how much money you have, if you don't have grassroots supports, you will lose. So if you are on the ground, this is my advice. Start organizing really early. As soon as you hear that there might be a change locally or in your state, start organizing, start thinking about the volunteer work you can put in. How many people here have volunteered to help pass the marijuana law? That's a lot of free work altogether here. So be strategic with offering that. Think about endorsements. Endorsements from the community are very important, especially now, because there's this concept of big marijuana. And right now, big marijuana isn't really a thing yet, but it's something that you can picture, and it's something that voters hate, and it's something that our opponents can possibly jump on, and that makes the community extremely important. So don't underestimate your power and start strategizing really early.
Thank you so much. Deborah, Lynn, you'll share that mic?
Yeah, I'm good. A couple of things. First off, I think that I want to come back to what you said about changing the culture. Because even in this room, there are many different ways in which we are relating to each other right now around cannabis. You know, we are all in agreement that people shouldn't be arrested for using it, but we're not all comfortable with the fact that people are using it. And I've had many conversations with people in the room about my smoking weed. And so I'm just like, let's be real about where we are in general. I sit here as a person who's a consumer, who's a grower, my 5th year. It's helped me learn a lot about the plant. I think it's something that everyone who consumes marijuana, whether or not you're in the business or not, you should actually learn to grow it. You should learn about the properties of the plant, how it grows, how to grow it organically, how to grow it healthily, how to cure it, all of that in the same way that you would with anything else. And I want us to acknowledge the fact that there are many people in our community who are in recovery and who've had very negative relationships with drugs. And so the conversation around cannabis consumption is confronting and triggering for a lot of people. And so, and there's not anything necessarily to be done with that per se, other than to acknowledge it and to include that in our communications with each other. Because if we're not comfortable with each other around this stuff, there's no way that we can make the world comfortable with it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, there are 3 pieces of things I want to say, so that's the first. The second has to do with the issue of young people. Because for me, that is a continuing third rail in this conversation. We're willing to support adult access to cannabis, but we still seem to have a problem when we're talking about teens, even though we know that 50% of our teens are smoking weed. And so I'm not going to suggest that we have an answer to this right now, but in the same way that we had to acknowledge and accept the reality that our young people were having sex before we wanted them to, and to find ways to support that from a harm reduction place, I want to be that way around cannabis too. Because I'll just say, as a parent, one of the more difficult conversations that I had raising my son was with other parents who objected to the fact that I allowed him and his friends to smoke weed in my house. And my response to them was that my first and foremost obligation is to keep my son out of the clutches of the cops. And so I'd rather have him in the house where I know where he is and who he's doing it with and what he's doing than out there on the street. But we still live in a see no evil, speak no evil culture and conversation in our community. So let's just be real about that. We got to work on that. The third thing I want to talk about is the money. So many of you don't know this, but in a previous life, I was a Wall Street lawyer. And, no, for real, I was. And so I got a chance to learn a little bit about money. And it had me thinking about how we can use that for where we are now. So the proposal I want to make to people, and for those of you, for the terms you follow, great. Afterward, if you don't, just talk to me afterwards. I don't want to get into explaining right now. But for those of you who are familiar with a social venture fund, social venture funding, which is a way of creating pools of money that can be used to support startup businesses, my idea is that we take a certain percentage, 2% is small but reasonable, amount of the profits from the marijuana sales, and set up a social venture type fund that's available for low-income people. I want to call it, for lack of a better term, the Fund for Growth. All pun intended. And because I'll admit to being somewhat conservative, and I think that people shouldn't just have free money, I also think that it's good for people to have some skin in the game. I'm also of Caribbean heritage, so my family believed in susu. So drawing on the practice of susu, I think that people from the communities that the pool of money has been set up for should set up what I call a community assisted self-help fund, acronym CASH, which works like a susu, that you put aside a certain amount of money each month. When it comes your turn to get your distribution, just like in the susu, your money is matched by the money from the social fund, from the Fund for Growth. So people have an incentive to save because they can increase their savings. The folks who are contributing to the Fund for Growth feel like everyone has some skin in the game, and the money can be used for any legitimate purpose. So you get past the idea that you're just using it to fund marijuana industry. It can be done for anything, to pay for education, to invest in a new business, to buy a house, to buy a car. For me, it's a way to have our people have a resource other than payday lending and other kind of predatory loans as a way to have access to capital. So, for me, that's just one thing, and that's the kind of thing that we can fight for. And if folks don't want to do it statutorily, it could be done voluntarily. And you can have the folks who contribute to the fund voluntarily have a trademark that goes on their product, just like there used to be a union label that encouraged people to buy the product because it was being sold by somebody who was contributing to the community. So for me, you can have a little black tree representing the Fund for Growth that is a trademark on those products. But either way, I want us to be thinking that way.
I just want to say one thing about what you're saying is in
Mike.
Oh, in the States, some of the process that you mentioned, can get people time. So if you have non-for-profits in your communities, non-for-profits are great ways to do fiscal conduit, which is exactly what you're saying, the legal way of doing it, fiscal conduit or social fiscal responsibility. I have a 501c3. Anyone in here have a 501c3? You just need to put an agreement together as a fiscal conduit And that is the legal way. That is the way that a lot of these corporations began their process of subsidiaries and subcontracting and developing businesses. So we need to take advantage of that as well.
Thank you, Simone. Let me get Lynn in this. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up for the group. We've got about 35 minutes left together. This is a great panel, right? Aren't they brilliant? They're brilliant. We're going to do one more question, then we're going to open it up to everybody in the room. Well, not all at once. You know what I mean?
So this issue about the finances is so critical, but I want to get back to your question about the State House, because I just want to spend a little bit more time on that, because I think it's critical that we get in our state houses and we make that change. And I think there's, again, 3 ways that we can do this. First of all, get yourself a lobbyist if you don't have one already. We have an amazing lobbyist.
Come on,
Backus,
Where's Glenn Backus? Woo!
You know, because
I'm trying to rewrite law based on what people are saying.
see, he never stops. And you need someone who's in your state house knocking on those doors, working the floor, working the bars at night. So you really need someone in the state house. So get yourself a lobbyist. Second, we need to invest as nonprofits in this work and as the industry into community organizing in the districts, especially where we don't have good representatives. And that's not just, talking to the leaders of, the handful of organizations, but it's putting money into grassroots organizing. Right now in California, we have the Willie Velasquez Institute holding town halls in multi-languages all across the state. We have the NAACP doing the same thing, but we should be doing much more, and everybody should be doing that so that you have people on the ground talking to the families, the parents, the teachers, etc. And then the third thing is, let's change who's in office if they're not working for us, right? Simone talked about a 501c3. Get yourself a 501c4. Open a PAC and put some money into the races. Let's get the people out who don't support us, and let's elect people who do. So that's my 3-point plan as an organizer.
Thank you so much, Lynn. So I want to come back, and forgive me for turning my back to the considerable crew who's holding it down on the floor over here. Let me come over here and ask this. Let's go back to the question of accountability, right? Because the Social Venture Fund is one way, and I think that that's an amazing opportunity. But what do we say to those who don't participate, and what do we do about that? I mean, I'm really, I come from the days where we boycotted everything and shut things down. We shut down Alexander's in New York when they, we shut things down. And I wonder what, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, Dream Hampton, a filmmaker, and she's from Detroit. Dream's a long-time, old-time stoner. And she said for the 4 years she lived in Detroit, Detroit, hear me on that. She had not bought weed from a single black person. That's what, Detroit! Detroit! How is that possible, right? And so this very much for her is an economic and class issue. And my daughter, who's sitting here in the first row, right here, Nisa's in the first row, yay, got to do her first panel, will tell you that in our Brooklyn neighborhood, with the gentrification that's going on, that I don't shop in the stores that gentrify and don't hire from the neighborhood. If there's not a brown face in there, there's not my black money in there. And that's just how that goes. And if you go in and you think it may be, she'll tell you that her mother will walk out quickly and make a scene. It's an embarrassing, please don't take my mother in there. That's how she do, right? You can look at her face like, this is horrible, this is what I live with every day. That's how it goes, boo. But that said, how do we hold the marijuana industry leaders and owners accountable? Look, she's like, I'm right here for that. She's like, I'm right here, so I'm gonna stop right there and pass the mic.
There you go. Okay. All right, let me say first that I absolutely think it's wonderful, and I encourage everyone from the movement to join the industry, because we are smart and we are resourceful and we can do this really well. and a lot of us here have our own businesses, absolutely support that. However, a for-profit industry cannot police itself. So I beg of you, if you're not in the industry, set up an independent mechanism to hold the industry accountable, and there should be no blurring of the lines between who holds us accountable and who the industry is.
I just want to get on this question now. I'm going to move it along a little bit quickly about, okay.
What we found work for the Caribbean and for Jamaica is the association, getting the people on the ground organized, getting them in a way that they can advocate for what they want in the industry. Because believe me, especially coming from the US, and I'm not knocking the US, but a lot of big companies are come knocking at our doors, and we see where we're about to have small farmers pushed out. And this is happening in an environment where there is a strong anti-drug use campaign going on by the National Council of Drug Abuse, and that is being supported by the US Embassy. Again, that's another irony. And so therefore, this is going to say that, okay, you can't use drugs and it's dangerous and it's illegal. However, there's a medical marijuana framework coming, and there's big company coming to give big support. Now, as a grassroots growers, we have to get our people organized, and I suspect that in a number of states here, that's something that is important. So association of these growers, and somebody mentioned advocating, talk about the vote count, especially when in small island states, you know, persons, we don't have set dates like you, but we do have elections that we can throw them out, and therefore they only pay us mine near to the election dates, but we organize around those dates to let our voices be heard. So that's something that's important.
Thank you, Vicki. And how many more comments do we have from here? Okay, so you.
I'm going to be real quick. A good regulatory scheme. I'm very happy to say that I think the city of Berkeley actually has a really good regulatory scheme for granting licenses that requires not just that you provide your green plan, your employment plan, your financial plan, but also how you're going to benefit the community. How many people are you going to hire from marginalized groups? And I think that going to what you were saying, that at the point in time of implementation, it's important to have people in the room who are going to write the regs that are going to actually give you the vehicles for accountability.
In the way of holding the industry accountable, right? The owners, people like me. I can tell you that in today's world, one of the things that impacts an owner more than anything almost, if you're looking for an immediate response, if a group of people get onto social media and begin to talk about what you don't like about a business, they respond. It doesn't take a lot of people either. You know, if you go on to, you know, or leafly.com or Sticky Guide or something like that, and you're talking about the products and saying that these people, they don't test, or, you know, hey, they do this or they do that, you will get a response. And to the degree that you can organize a group of people who are going to police an industry within a certain market, and you make it their job to go out and actually, make it their job to go out and actually say these things in a public forum that other people can hear and other people can see, they will act.
Thank you so much, Boyd. And let me take this room scan really quick. I'm going to start from this side and move back around. Dr. Ron Daniels, I see you, my friend. Let me just say this. I'm a mic holder, because you know some of us don't know what to do when we get the mic. So don't be, you can hold my hand if you want, but you're not holding the mic. All right, we good? Okay.
So when I moderated yesterday, I held the mic because she told me to hold the mic, okay? Well, first of all, let me just quickly say that the conversation about reparations I'm compelled to stand and speak on. It's interesting that a week before the conference, I actually sat down with Ethan for at least an hour. The subject was reparations. And so as I hear this conversation unfold, I'm really anxious that we sort of talk about this, so because very often in the movement we have parallel tracks that don't connect. So my sister, or our friend from Jamaica, Of course, we have a CARICOM Reparations Commission now, headed by the Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies, Sir Hilary Beckles. We now also have in the United States of America a National African American Reparations Commission. And one of the points, we have a 10-point program, and one of the points deals with reparations for the war on drugs and mass incarceration. Now I say all that because, and let me just quickly say, Nkechi Taifa, who you all know is a part of that, Roger Wareham is a part of that, the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, Dr. Julianne Malvo, Professor Charles Ogletree, and Dr. Iva Carruthers are all a part of the 17-person commission. So I say that because I want us to be connected as these conversations move forward. So you can go to the website ibw21.org, ibw21.org. There is a huge reparations resource center that has all of this information on it. So I invite you to join in on it because we're going to be looking to all of you as we push this conversation forward. We want to do it in partnership and not in competition with each other. Thank you very much.
Let me acknowledge Dr. Ron James, who for many of us has been a long-standing mentor and activist. He taught me for many years about 25 or more years ago about how to stand strong in my principles and speak truth to power. He then ran the Center for Constitutional Rights for many years in New York, and since then has run the Institute for the Black World and has been organizing people all around this country in Haiti and in the Caribbean, and is just, an extraordinary resource. If you don't go to his website, then go right to him because he's the real deal himself.
Marijuana is too expensive. How can we structure the industry so it sells for about the same as coffee, which is about $15 a pound?
I guess that's me. Well, one, let me say that I think competition does have a significant impact on pricing. However, if you're trying to get a plant that is as diverse as marijuana strains can be, I think you're probably going to see a framework that's more like that of wine, where you have varying levels of quality and price reflective thereof. Similarly with things like cigars or other things. So I don't know if it'll ever get down to the price of coffee or a tomato, but you'll probably have products that span the range as we learn to appreciate different things and we do begin to get educated on what it means to cure for 30 days versus 60 days versus 6 months and things of that nature. We can respect quality thereof.
Just a reminder that the session is being recorded. When you speak, hold the mic up here. Okay?
I don't know where marijuana is expensive, certainly not in the Caribbean, because we're not getting anything for it. And no, that's the reality. We have persons who are still struggling, and that's the problem we're having when U.S. persons hear, oh, medical marijuana industry, because here comes a market where we can. You mentioned coffee, we're suffering. Don't mention coffee, banana, and sugar in the Caribbean. That's slave labor for us, and we're now positioning to make slave labor in cannabis industry, and we have to fight against that because persons are getting ready to make us slaves again in cannabis. I'm sorry, not in our environment.
Let me go to the next question. I'll start on this side, then I'm gonna come back over to the other side, okay?
This conference has been so energizing, but I am left disappointed with the lack of radicalism I hear in the movement when it comes to social and economic justice. This panel is exactly what I needed, so thank you for that. Producing drugs just happens to be more profitable than caging humans, so we need to keep in mind the true bottom line of our moneyed partners. We have to make room for investment, particularly within our current Citizens United reality, but to let moneyed interests drive and divide the reform movement the way I've seen it done in Ohio this year without taking a strong stance makes me worried for the future of the movement and disappointed in some of the leaders of the movement for not taking a stronger stance on this issue. So we talked about how we can hold the industry accountable, but how can we hold our reformers accountable?
Yeah. SSDP in the house. SSDP in the house. Represent. I want to get an answer. Do you want to speak to holding reformers accountable? Yeah. I'm letting you answer that. Okay.
I'll take it.
Go ahead. Come on, because you know you and I can go right in. We can start by having an ever more clear, although I think we've got a pretty damn good one, vetting process when it comes to who we fund from Drug Policy Alliance. And I know we do a pretty good job because I've got a good team working with me. So I'll start right there.
So absolutely, who we fund, who our partners are, but also who we hire in our reform organizations and what standards, what we ask during the hiring process and what standards we hold people to once they're there. So, and I think that particularly when it comes to marijuana, there's a lot of tensions. At least with our organization. And I'll give you one of them that's been especially challenging for me when it comes to the industry and particularly legalization, which is the issue of the industry, people who have really been pioneers and forerunners in the industry and done a lot of work during the gray market. And they want priority licensing, right? And I understand that, I get it. But in order to give them priority licensing, we're making somebody else a second or a third priority. One of the things we wanted to do in California was essentially have a set-aside. A certain percentage of licenses are going to go to communities of color, people of color. Because of the California Constitution, we cannot do that. If you live in a state where affirmative action is not illegal, then you might want to consider doing that. That's getting back to the accountability question. But it's asking these questions at every stage. In California, with the marijuana legalization initiative that we're working on now, we often get a lot of criticism because one of the alleged funders is one of these big money people. But I have to say that we stayed at that table. It wasn't fun, it wasn't easy. We kept making the points. We said we wouldn't settle if they didn't address these points. And we stayed in the room, and it would have actually been easier to walk away and do our own thing and probably lose. But what we did was stay in the room with some of the big money people and came to something that we think in the end is actually pretty progressive and definitely will be the most progressive initiative if it wins.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
Hi, I've been struck by the conversation, sort of the parameters of the conversation. It's around regulation, and it's about sort of taking something that is structurally exclusionary with high thresholds for participation through licensing fees or reserve capital, and trying to, whittle around the edges of that and make it more exclusionary. And I'm really wondering, I really question that, us being limited by that framework. And also that we're going to have and it reminds me of the discussion earlier about fear and about how we operate in a context of fear. This whole idea of regulation addresses this implicit fear that an unregulated market is so dangerous. I mean, because all these people are dying from marijuana in this unregulated market, right? I mean, it plays upon that fear and it doesn't challenge that perception. So I would challenge us to look at other ways of doing it besides a regulated market. One thing I would point to is the history of beer deregulation. Beer, in the late 70s, when Jimmy Carter deregulated the beer market, there were 5 breweries in this country, all consolidated. And then with the deregulation, we had this proliferation of microbreweries. And now there's about 3,000 breweries in the US. So if you're thinking about removing barriers to participation from marginalized communities that don't have the capital to access this regulated market, no matter whatever efforts we do, make no mistake that market is very valuable and there are money interests that are going to maintain their control over it to a large extent. So I really would like us to think about a structure, a different kind of structure that will allow more participation.
Thank you so much. So let me give you this one here.
Just briefly, someone mentioned here before that we needed to create sort of a group to regulate, and I think that component that you're speaking of would be something that group or that collective could take on. I don't know if anyone else has something.
I know Vicky wanted to come to that, and I'm going to come over to this end of the room.
For us in the Caribbean, that's why the issue of the having dialogue with our Rastafarian community and the traditional growers are important because we want to give them a voice in whatever regulation is crafted. I mean, as the legislation stands now, it's limiting because we're asking for licenses and for land titles that they don't have. And we've been able to leverage some kind of dialogue with our ministers in letting them know that this is our discomfort with it. And it has kind of been bearing fruit because we are now getting offers of having conversation with the government about how do we treat with the matter of land access and land titles. However, some ministers now also see the marijuana industry as a big industry. So we have one particular minister suggesting that the government itself go into the growing of ganja. So we have those new issues coming up. But we understand, as you said, a community and cultural approach to the regulation. So it's not just standards, but how do we engage our traditional folk communities?
Thank you so much. And let me just note, we have about 12 minutes.
Can I get at that a little bit?
Go ahead.
Just really quickly.
Yes.
One of the reasons why you see a lot of states right now beginning to consider limited markets more so than open markets is because in places where we see open markets, we tend to see clustering. And they tend to cluster in communities that don't want that much clustering, for instance. You know, just like gun shops in the ghetto, if you think about it. You know, because they're going to chase low-cost land, they're going to end up in sort of your lower income communities and things of that nature. So you're going to have a higher density of these kinds of businesses there, and it's going to create public outcry. And so a lot of time you see very limited licenses. Cities try to control things with zoning and things like that. And so there has to be a healthy balance, though, because we have to create open markets that people can get into, but we do have to be respectful of the just sort of quiet enjoyment of other people in the community as well.
Thank you so much. And we only have a very, very few minutes left for the number of hands that have gone up. I would really encourage you to continue these conversations outside of this room and to the maximum extent possible, capsule your comments, your questions, and our responses so we can get as many voices in the room.
So what I hear little of in this conversation is about environmental justice. I'm glad that you bring up land. I'm from Humboldt County, where Emerald Triangle World, you know, is known for its marijuana production. And what's happening there is that streams are being shut down, the watersheds are being destroyed. And the people of color in Humboldt County are the native indigenous people. And the way that they're trying to take back their land is by getting the DEA to come in and shut down these little growers, these small farmers that have come in on their land to take them over and destroy them. So I don't think no regulation is smart, but I want to know how can we include environmental justice in this conversation.
Can I have one person respond to that? Is there one person, Lynn?
That's been a huge issue in California. We work closely with legions of environmental organizations in drafting the initiative. So the initiative has 20% of the revenue allocation going to environmental remediation, restoration, and then upkeep in the parks. And in the one place where we did retain the felony for marijuana is for growing on either national park lands or indigenous lands.
Thank you, Lynn.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm from Nevada, and I helped write the dispensary law there. I've got a background at ACLU, and I'm proud to say that in Nevada, you can have a felony record that would otherwise have been considered legal under the now dispensary law, and any felony arrest or record older than 10 years is automatically not taken into consideration if you want to be a licensed grower or operator. So come to Nevada, and you can come work too. But on the regulatory side of things, I think it's really important looking forward and on the advocacy and also environmental justice side of things. There are states that are requiring that growing be indoor. And so that is an injustice. If we can't grow outdoor and use the power of the sun, that's ridiculous. I want to...
absolutely. This is like 6 new hands just went up.
Sure. I would suggest for everybody that wants to be a part of things, you're right, you do need a lobbyist. So come talk to me. And then go to the next session. I see Dustin here, Sue Sisley's here.
What's that session, Rebecca? What's the name of the session?
It's medical cannabis labs.
Okay, and is
because the uses of cannabis, you're right, everybody needs to know about the strains and what's right for their body, because once we know what's right for our body, we can know what's right for our community.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna zigzag a little bit.
Hello, just quickly, as we talk about justice in different types of ways, I would like for someone to speak on the access of medicinal cannabis and ensuring that everyone has access to a doctor or a licensed professional in order to figure out what strains are right for them, because having these initial fees that can be hundreds if not thousands of dollars is injustice as well when it comes to healthcare. So as we speak about regulation and access injustice, we definitely need to talk about the U.S. healthcare system.
Thank you. Simone, do you want to take that on? Or is it, you mean, it may just be a comment that the doctors are
I think that's a great comment, but what we're finding is a lot of physicians are just as afraid to enter the market at this point as people are to be open about the need that they have for it medically. So how do we do that? I think it's the larger conversation that we, for example, in New York, our racial justice group are going to take that. We're going to take that on in addition to getting people educated about the proper use of the substance. We're going to take on the doctors and make sure that they feel some sort of comfort in, being able to refer. But it's going to take time.
Thank you. And I'm noting we have 6 minutes left, so I'm begging your forgiveness now.
Can you guys address or suggest some strategies as to how to hold our politicians and regulators accountable so that in the initiative, Shailene, in Massachusetts, there's language that's essentially aspirational because of the laws, because we can't put preferences in. And in New York, we have politicians holding up bags of weed talking about decriminalization when that actually happened 20 years ago. So can we talk about how, and it's not decriminalized. I'm a criminal defense attorney in New York, and I get calls all the time of people getting arrested for small amounts of cannabis. So how do we hold politicians accountable for that?
Okay, New York. So decriminalize, New York, hello, Brooklyn. Decriminalization began actually in Brooklyn with Ken Thomas, and you do not receive a felony anymore. You actually receive sort of a penalty.
Decriminalization was in New York in 1977.
No, but
what Ken Thompson did was he stopped incarcerating.
Right. So, but also you don't receive a felony for it. So there is sort of a change in that process, in that you will get a ticket as opposed to being incarcerated and actually having a felon for a small portion of.
People get arrested in order to get that ticket, and you have to ask for that ticket. You can be held in jail for hours unless you know to ask.
That's right.
My desk appearance ticket.
Right.
And this is part of, I'm gonna just bring this to a close and say,
very short. The answer to how to hold regulators accountable when they're not following the law is to call them out in the media.
Thank you.
Hi, Barry Abrams. I have 2 questions. The first is, how do we get a copy of this video or get access to the video? Second question is, I'm from Prince George's County, Maryland, and I want to find out, how do you deal with 800 churches that may put up a block to this?
That was one of my questions, homie.
Hallelujah.
Thank you. So I'm trying. So one of the questions that he asked is just so important is that we have blocks in our own communities, right? And sometimes our faith means we ain't got no freedom. And how do we deal with that? Can one person want to speak to that? Go ahead. Look at Liz. Look at the only white one on the panel. So I'm gonna step right up in that. I ain't even afraid.
We have a serious faith strategy in California. If anybody from Justice Not Jails is in the room, please stand up. Anybody from OCO, Oakland Community Organizations, please stand up. Anybody from NAACP. Okay, so those 3 organizations, we are currently funding them from DPA through our C3 side to organize in the faith community, to bring these conversations to congregations across all denominations, have those difficult conversations amongst themselves. Doesn't mean they're going to come out on our side, but at least they're having those conversations, and we need to do a lot more of it.
And and it's organizing there. It's it's getting from the pulpit to the pew, right? So as you come out of that. And if you stop going to somebody's church and tithing, I mean, let's think about Missouri, right? We're not going to do it. We're just not going to do it. And if your minister is not responding in the way you want them to respond, you don't have to go to their church. That'll change them quick. Deborah?
We also need to stop allowing politicians to lift up preachers over people. Okay? I mean, like, seriously. The idea that just because you're the head of the church that you're speaking for the community was belied by the first Obama campaign, where all of them came out for Hillary until their parishioners said hell no. So I would actually like us to stop lifting up the preachers as opposed to the people in their congregations, and particularly the young people.
That's right.
They're the ones who are going to church but not being listened to. And if we actually lifted them up, not only would the elected officials listen to them, but the preachers might listen to them too.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm going to take 2 questions, Jennifer and Norris, and then we're going to have to say goodbye for now. I'm sorry. I'm doing the best I can. Don't look. Y'all packed up this room. That's not my fault.
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Deborah, I just wanted to lift up what you said about the Social Venture Fund. I think that's an incredible idea. I think we could have a whole conversation about radical economic models. And I'm calling on some organizer friends who say we cannot go where we have not first traveled in our minds. And so I wanted to ask you, beyond looking to these ballot initiatives, and I so appreciate the amazing work of DPA to make these more radically inclusive, but what kind of economic models, community loan funds, non-collateral finance, non-extractive financing terms that can be seeded by philanthropy, because let's all be honest, that's stolen capital and should be the one that's seeding these new economic models. What kind of conversation can we have? And I just wanted to make a connection that there's a divestment movement in this country and a reinvestment movement around environmental justice. How can we link arms with these people to think about how that can have value to our movement? And there are folks like the Working World and the Fund for Democratic Communities I think we should be working with. And I just wanted to put that question to this panel, because I think until we talk about the economic piece, we really, we need more power coming from the economics of the community rather than looking to the ballot initiatives for that.
That's Jennifer Neer from the Libra Family Foundation, a longtime ally, like her predecessor Hilda before, my colleague and peer in this work. It's been one of the few small foundations to be brave enough to stand in support of drug policy. Please recognize her.
And I just want to push back on, I want to go back to the accountability question, and the accountability question about the folks on the panel. Because all I'm hearing is about the leaders in the industry. Pookie was the leader in the industry. That's what the leader in the industry was. Pookie been slanging from here to China. But now Pookie can't get into this market. The brother talked about, well, we need to look at this because everybody don't need to get a license because of density. When you brought alcohol in our community, there's liquor store in every damn corner. So this shit about who's the leaders in this industry and who's going to get paid off this industry, we got people still in the pen. I got a brother in the pen, been in there 40 years. So Pookie already knows the means and the method. Because Pookie know how to package it, Pookie know how to manufacture it, Pookie know how to distribute it. So if Pookie is being left out of this conversation, ain't nobody kind of like got our back. So that's where accountability goes. That accountability goes to the folks who are at these tables negotiating without Pookie being at the table.
And so as we began this conversation, we ended with Norris Henderson, who did 27 years in the state of Louisiana for a crime he didn't commit, came home, started an organization, Vote, and has changed laws in Louisiana, and it helped inspire the formerly incarcerated convicted people's movement. That is all we have for this morning. We hope you continue the conversation and thank this extraordinary panel.